The language was different, but every intonation was like you were listening to either MSNBC or Fox News. Every manner of talking about human life was fitted into an event cycle that somehow I had learned only in this country. And then you realize that somehow some other form of homogenization is happening in the world. It's not only the export of cars and labor, it is the export of ways of suffering in the world. It is an approach to feeling, it is an approach to affect. And that is the only way one can imagine politics being something that is not a matter of governance or something that happens up there, but something that is on an everyday basis determining what you and I feel for, what you and I will die for, right? What you and I will want to live for. So the question of heartbreak kind of became this thing that stuck in my head, and when I came back here, and any South Asian will tell you that it takes about 3 weeks to come back to normalcy. And so it isn't a matter of, it isn't culture shock in this simple way, and it isn't the idea that somehow I want you to understand how different I am and accept my difference. What I'm trying to say is that something about that transition is a transition to accept that my heart just breaks in more ways when I'm back home. And not because I love the people more or somehow they are more mine than everybody who I've lived and grown with in this country for the past 11 or 12 years, but there is an abundance of emotional provocation. People want you to respond emotionally. It's not an encroachment of someone to imagine somehow that you will ask them for an emotional provocation or want to respond in that way. And that somehow my world here, the range of emotions I can feel on a daily basis and the range of emotional provocations I can give to another person just shrinks. And I don't know what to do about that. So I have been writing on suffering and love for the imaginable adult life in this country. And I'm here bringing the question to you. What do you think heartbreak is? And what do you think it might have to do with politics? And my sense is that politics, if it is about anything, it is about who our heart breaks for and why. Right? And not in some simple, mushy way. I'm not trying to write a Sweet Dreams novel here. Like, I'm really trying to get at a form of emotionality that is not horror. I mean, because we do associate lots of sentiments with politics, right? Look at what's happening on TV now. I mean, there's horror, there's fear, there's trauma, there's repulsion, there's loudness, there's virility, there's just venom, and then there is the ever-present victim for whom our heart is always supposed to go out as long as they tell you their story, just so your heart can go out enough without making you feel complicit in anything that might have happened to them. So there's a certain way that for me the question of this demand somebody can make on your emotion, and Professor Small mentioned, you know, I'm very privileged to be in the right sort of order of things, the day having been begun by really noted speakers who worked on this, but there's something else that's happening in the world right now that we need to try to grasp, the given categories of thinking about empathy and sympathy and guilt and responsibility will just not work. Because the more we see a certain form of homogenization of how people's sufferings are interpreted, what meaning is given to them, how we regard their suffering as exchangeable or commodifiable or objectifiable, and because then somehow we all assume that people are working towards similar ends, or that they are working towards a certain kind of encashment of their suffering, this assumption that it will somehow end and then things will be better, I think we are making a big mistake there. Well, so maybe I should ask you for another sort of imaginative journey, right? Let's imagine there's a museum called the Museum of Dead Suffering. What would we find there? Maybe a memorial, right? We had a lovely speech on that, you know, referred to the Holocaust. I'm thinking Auschwitz. We imagine. What else do we imagine when we think of dead suffering? Perhaps perhaps whenever a big disaster, like we know it, gets translated into either statistics that make it a grand disaster, so it can sort of even register on our screens, or when we respond to it by counting the number of dollars we texted to Haiti, right? There's a certain way that both of these measurements are mediating our relationship to that suffering that's out there, right? There are other ways that we confront that suffering. And I think that when we walk into that supposed museum, we might also find somewhere there little cages named harm, injury, and pain. All things that have in some ways domesticated, right? This isn't anything other than domesticated, tamed life, right? Something that's been enclosed into things that maybe surround the body, the outline of our body, and that anything in excess of that seems to be unkempt, messy, something we won't go into, right? So we need a certain degree of clarity, we need a certain form of, and then we associate these injuries with people with histories with endless memories of enslavement or hurt and harm, and then we reduce the people to those injuries we can identify so that they can perform their sufferings for us over and over again and say those same things, and their visibility and their humanity in our view will be reducible to that injury that we do know. So at one point in the museum, they're going to tell you, well, I think you're in the wrong place, go outside, because you will find that suffering everywhere you go. Any moment where you ask somebody to tell you a story about their pain, any moment where that is the premise of your compassion for another person's performance or presentation of their own suffering in a certain manner, rather than you realizing that perhaps there's a role we have, not in necessarily creating the suffering, I'm not concerned about that in this moment, but in making suffering present in a certain way that we end up becoming part of an economy that isn't only concerned about who suffers how much, right, so that we can give people good health care and give them social security, but in what ways people suffer and how we produce those sufferings, not by being the white person who built the boat, who brought all the slaves, but we produce the suffering every day by making a demand on its presence in a certain manner. And it has everything to do with the sensual apparatus that our societies impose us, the ways our sufferings and our pathos, our love and our pain are conscripted in the structures that want us to perform and behave in a certain way. So that being said, brings to mind the fact that perhaps with this death suffering, like with any other kind of death, what would death mean if there wasn't life, right? If there weren't you and I to bury someone? If there wasn't those who remember the dead, right? There have to be, even in these monuments of injury and pain and harm, there has to be living suffering somewhere, lurking around, right? Carrying the burden of the dead suffering. Some of us have to do that more than others. Some of us cannot give up that burden too easily because it's written on our faces or it's branded on our arms, but still there is some life that happens that might be the place to look at in order to reconnect our hopes for the future. Let's not look at when we have already produced Haiti into the biggest disaster of history, but let's look at the living that allows that suffering to shame us, given what is it that people live with and survive, and what forms of communities they create with nothing, right, where it isn't an identifiable, conceivable end to the suffering any time in the future.